Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute, and here with me, as always, is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve and inflation today because the new inflation data came out on Wednesday. And it turns out inflation in the month of March was at more than a 40-year high. Basically, you have to go back to December of 1981 to find a year-over-year measure of inflation that's higher than March's 8.5% inflation rate. That's up from February's 7.9%, which was a rate that reflected pre-Ukraine war numbers. And that's really about 12 months of significantly higher inflation above the 2% inflation target that the Fed is so fond of talking about. And so we're in this environment now where inflation is 5%, 6%, 7% mounting each month. And what's the Fed doing about it? Well, so far we have one increase of 0.25% to the federal funds rate. So now it's up at a whopping 0.5%. And that's after years of being essentially at zero of 0.2, or officially at 0.25%. But we're basically talking about 0% real rates when we're looking at the federal funds rate. And so now they're saying, oh yeah, well, we're gonna do a bunch of hawkish stuff in 2022. And they started talking about this in late 2021, where they started to just sound more urgent in what they were going to do. But every month they talk about some amazing stuff they're going to do. They're going to do tons of rate increases, and they're going to also scale back the balance sheet, which is what they've been talking about. But I'm skeptical of how much of that's going to actually take place. After months of talking about it, we've got a whopping 0.25 percentage point increase, and the balance sheet is still hanging out at $8.9 trillion. And so when is the Fed going to do something? A lot of the talk is just that the Fed is behind the ball on this, they're behind the curve, that they don't really have anything planned. Also, the fear is that if they take any sort of drastic steps, they're going to trigger a recession, which of course be a huge problem for the administration. So I don't know what they're going to do. But one thing I do note, though, is that they've been consistently wrong now for years about inflation, about how much of a threat it has been, about when it's coming and how high it's going to get. And so now that they're saying, oh, yeah, well, we've peaked or it'll soon be receding. It was pretty transitory. We were wrong about it being really transitory, but now it's kind of transitory. And so it'll be gone soon. What reason do we have to believe this, people? They've given no indication. They have any idea what's going wrong. And so when are they going to start getting it right, though?
Yeah, they announced the Putin price hike, I think is the new branding of inflation today. And it's interesting. This is something, obviously, the Mises Wire has been noting for quite a while now. There's a great fun little article by Jonathan Newman back in the good old days of 2016 where he talks about the Fed who cried growth, which was the degree to which, if you look backwards at the Fed's past projections on what they expect the economy to look like. I mean, they're consistently wrong and sometimes spectacularly so. But when we're thinking about inflation in the short term and these great groups of policy elites, their ability to handle it. First and foremost, that people, I think it's always worth reminding people. A few years ago, the biggest crisis for central bankers, not only in the U.S. but kind of the West as a whole, was their concerns about inflation not being high enough. Right? This was seen as the biggest thing. They were trying to identify new tools that they could come up with to goose inflation. Which I think is always relative to bring up when we talk about it now, and because there tends to be this kind of this reflexive viewpoint where they're always trying to identify all sorts of other justifications for inflationary pressures besides the Fed's own policies. And you're right. We were looking at a few different things. We're thinking about measuring the Fed's own performance, the tools at hand. It's not simply the federal funds rate; it's the size of the balance sheet. And it's interesting when you look and you break down some of the Fed decision makers, both on the board itself, as well as the presidents of various Federal Reserve banks, not all of which have a voting role. Every year there's kind of a rotating thing there. But it's interesting watching their comments over time and seeing how many of them are. You can see a level of sort of intellectual consistency, even if it might be something we would disagree with in some ways. Which are the ones that recognize that their expectations were wrong and care up and at least have enough internal sort of integrity and intellectual curiosity to try to, reflect on why they were wrong. And then some of the ones that just have like nothing to say at all, which is again, once again, should give us a great amount of confidence for a technocratic body that continues to manage to give itself more and more power as time goes on.
Yeah, that's something that Fed watchers, of course, discovered long ago, was that personalities matter, and the different people on the Fed say different things and do have, in fact, different opinions. Although it does appear that unity on the Fed board has been considerably higher, say, in the last 20 or 30 years than was the case before that. Not that there was ever really any great debate on the Fed board, but part of the reality is that at least in the era of Greenspan, because Greenspan was so powerful in Washington, he was able to really quash dissent to a significant amount. But nevertheless, you still had some of those holdouts back in the past, the not too distant past. You say you had Tom Honig, who was from the Kansas City Fed, and he often was way more of a inflation hawk than the rest of the board. His replacement, Esther George, is relatively more sane than the rest of the board, but not quite like Honig. And so you do see some differences there, and you do have, of course, then your super dubs like Lael Brainerd. And these people just consistently have the wrong policy prescription over and over and over again. And yet, I mean, you just see them. They're on all the shows. They're expressing all of their opinions. And this is, of course, what was happening on Wednesday after we were looking at what it is that the Fed had planned. And after the inflation numbers came out, I watched the Wall Street Journal's interview with Brainerd. And first of all, it's hard to watch because literally, and I'm not even exaggerating, literally every word out of her mouth was an or an ah. So either she had no confidence in what she was saying, or she was just making stuff up, or she's just a bad public speaker. I don't know. I hadn't seen her speak much before that, but she didn't really have prepared remarks. But every question was it just produced the usual bromides from her, right? Well, inflation is a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and before that it was COVID, and who could have predicted that? But everything we were doing was really correct, but we got thrown some curveballs, and we're going to keep an eye on the data. If you've been reading the Beige Book all these years, it's all the same stuff over and over again. Lots of measured weasel words about the relative strength of the economy. And then we're going to keep our eye on the data. And then we're going to make the right decision, which, of course, has been wrong now for years. They haven't been making the right decisions. Anybody can see that. If you're just a normal family now, the cost of living is just going through the roof. And so I think if you take the time, most people don't have this time, but if you take the time to really start paying attention to these people, they're so unimpressive in what they bring to the debate. And I think a certain disease infects people's views on the Fed board in the same way as with the Supreme Court, as if it was some sort of great meritocracy where only the greatest geniuses, the greatest minds among us make it onto this board and get to be appointed by the president. Of course, that's not the reality at all. And yet, I don't know how much it seems the Fed's reputation has not, at least in Washington, been significantly damaged. As an institution, nobody's seriously questioning their control over all of these levers in the economy that they can pull and push. But it's obvious these people don't know what they're doing.
Well, and Brainerd in particular is interesting because she's someone who has explicitly been a partisan. She was a big donor to the Clinton campaign in 2016, which I'm not surprised by her political views in particular, but the fact that someone going out of their way to kind of take these explicitly political stands is always interesting. Again, also interesting that I remember back in the day, you had people freaking out about Trump considering nominating Stephen Moore or Herman Cain or Judy Shelton, because these people were portrayed as threatening the independence of the Fed, and yet Lael Brainard, who's a donor of who could the person who could conceivably elevate her position on the Fed, that's no big deal at all. Again, there's nothing that I'm sure surprises our viewers, some hypocrisy on this front, but she in particular, she's been elevated to vice chairman of the Fed, someone who was considered as a possible replacement for Powell, someone who was in the running for the Treasury Secretary. And so again, if in terms of Democratic policy wonks, I mean, she's one of the most respected voices out there, at least from the positions that she has been close to getting, and so that should worry us even more when we think about the meritocracy of the Fed itself. One of the things that's unfortunate is that it's very interesting, as you mentioned, the personalities of those involved, and this becomes a bigger and bigger deal the more that the Fed's credibility and its reliance upon communication as a policy tool in itself. Right, they're since the Bernanke days in particular. While Greenspan obviously kind of really elevated the personality of the Fed chair during Bernanke, communication and forward guidance became a very what the Fed viewed as a very significant tool. And so when you see just little changes in tone between a Federal Reserve president from New York versus Dallas or San Francisco or something like that, these little personality differences become overanalyzed and things like that, and it's always just very interesting to see kind of the differences in content from some of these individuals, because you got someone like a Raphael Bostic from the Atlanta Fed, someone else who is considered to be a potential replacement for Powell before Biden renominated him. It's interesting that there hasn't been any forward march on that confirmation yet. Maybe with things going as they are, that there could be some interesting political changes there. But this is a guy who is basically okay with going along with anything that is popular at the moment. Within the course of a month, he talked about maybe we might need two rates hikes. Maybe we need 3. 4 or more, who knows? He has no particular sort of firm statement. He was one of the biggest advocates talking about how it's going to be transitory inflation early last year, and mentioned how surprised he was when he had all these business leaders in Atlanta saying, "Oh no, it's going to be longer than that." So again, someone who was being considered as a possible new Fed chair. Can you break down those statements and you see very, very little of a true operating framework here besides reaction to kind of whatever the news of the day is?
It's so obvious that what they're doing is entirely ad hoc, that there's no sense of what repeated increases in the Fed funds rate would do and how much would be required to really rein in inflation. And really what that really means is how much would be required to induce a recession and then really stop inflation that way. And yeah, I've seen predictions ranging anywhere from 2.5% to 5% in terms of multiple rate increases, sometimes a 0.5% at a time, taking all the way up to 5% throughout the rest of this calendar year. But boy, would that be a dramatic thing. I mean, if we look back at the history of the Fed funds rate over the last 30 years, the last time it was at 5%, it looks like it reached about 5.25% back in 2007, followed soon thereafter by the financial crisis and recession in late 2008 and into 2009. And then before that, it looks like it reached about 6.5% in 2001, followed, of course, by a recession at the end of that year. So if they're talking about raising it to 5%, they're clearly talking about inducing a recession, unless, of course, there's some way they can use the balance sheet or some other sort of non-traditional experimental monetary policy to prevent a recession from happening on paper. And of course, the very definition of what we're talking about now with recession is of limited use, right? If you could keep economic growth going, but inflation is very, very high, they can then say, hey, look, we avoided a recession. Everything's fine, just like has happened in Japan over the last 30 years, right? They haven't had any big financial crises or collapses. They've just had this long, slow, what would you call it, cram down on the standard of living, people working longer hours than ever, people's standard of living, their living space getting smaller, no real advances in economic life, economic benefits. But there hasn't been a financial crisis, hasn't been an economic collapse. So I guess that's a big success story. And that's what the regime would tell you over there. But the reality is, if you have avoided a recession in terms of its strict definition, but people's actual standard of living is going down, who cares? Well, what's important is really economic growth in real terms and are people's lives getting better. And I think maybe they're looking for a way to trick people into thinking that the economy's fine. And we're seeing a lot of that now, right? The media is obsessed with this idea that economic growth is dynamite and that it's great and everybody's doing amazingly well. And you can trot out all of these Beltway type economists to talk about how people are too stupid to understand that the economy is really great. And if you had a PhD in economics, you'd realize that your lifestyle is amazing and has never been better. But since you're a regular person, you think you're poor. And that seems to be a line being used now. But if you look at the actual data, there's nothing impressive about it at all. You look at, say, job growth, still 2 million jobs below the peak back in 2019. Okay, nothing amazing there. Let's look at actual labor force participation. That's still below what it was back in 2019, and that's in terms of the 25 to 54 age group. I'm pulling potential retirees out of there. So nothing impressive there. And now let's look at what can you afford in terms of a house. Well, the 30-year mortgage rate just hit 5% and has gone higher than that. And it hasn't been there since 2011. And so affordability now is going out the window in terms of home purchasing. And so looking at all of this, as well as looking at inflation and food and fuel, and the fact that there's no deflation in any of the categories included in the CPI data. So you're just looking out there as a regular person, especially someone who's starting out, and things are not going well for you. But the narrative, they're going to try and push the narrative that things just aren't as bad as they seem. And maybe the Fed can even somehow prevent a recession. And if that requires 8, 9% inflation, well, then so be it. But of course, even 3, 4, 5% inflation really adds up over just a 10-year period, and you lose a huge amount of your wealth and your real purchasing power if wages aren't keeping up, which they aren't, of course. In my Wednesday article on inflation, wages aren't keeping up with inflation. Real wages are going down if you're looking at hourly earnings, which is really basically the best data we have in terms of the aggregates. So again, nothing to brag about, nothing to crow about from the regime here. But I expect them to run all sorts of interference and trying to convince people that things are really actually going pretty well.
Right. And of course, when you factor in the core inflation numbers, don't include little pesky things like food and fuel. And of course, anyone that's been to the gas pump or the grocery store lately knows there's nothing to be seen there in terms of cost increases for your average American worker, yada, yada. It is interesting to see there's some members, like in particular, because again, there's this idea that, okay, well now we have the ability of being very aggressive now. There's as you mentioned, there's been some talk of even going as high as 5%. If we look at the most recent Fed dot chart, which kind of charts expectations of various Fed members, there the kind of average projection for 2022 and longer is somewhere around 2.5%. There are some Fed members saying that number should be closer to 3.5%. You have James Bullard of the St. Louis Fed, who is saying that now's the time to get super aggressive. That this year the federal funds rate should be over 3%, which again, historically, this was something that we haven't seen since in over a decade. But what's interesting is that you think back to 2018, and when some of these the kind of the core fundamental numbers were genuinely good, you had people. Yeah, like, I mean, that and what happened? We had by the end of 2018, they were already stopping normalization of the balance sheet, and you had people like John Williams, who moved from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank to the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is kind of seen as an improvement. He was giving talks in September of 2018, bragging about how the Fed is charting a course for normality. And then a few months later, they're having to pivot already, right? So again, by their own public statements, some of the more respected members of the Fed thought they were out of the woods, and back in 2018 had to reverse course. How do you plan? The idea that we can go over 3% in 2022 with all the other with so much other problems going on? Again, you color me a little skeptic right now.
Well, it's fun to look back at what some of these people were saying, of course, in the past as well about inflation, because people, of course, have already forgotten about the obsession with getting the inflation rate up above 2%. And so for so long, all the talk was, well, inflation's too low. We need to get it up. And we've got all these problems. And they would ask Janet Yellen when she left the Fed, what regrets do you have? She's like, well, inflation was too low. And Jerome Powell has said how inflation is the great challenge of our time. And it's just astounding. First of all, the 2% inflation standards is a totally arbitrary thing they just picked back in the late 90s, Yellen being one of the main progenitors, the pushers of that idea. And ever since then, it's been this obsession. And so when all of your thinking and all of your goal setting and all of your policy is set toward getting inflation higher, it's no wonder that these people have absolutely nothing in their toolbox when inflation suddenly gets to be significantly higher than what they were trying to get for all of these years. And so now they're just out there just saying variations on the same thing over and over and over again, trying to assure the markets that they're going to be able to solve everything. And then you never see any actual new ideas come down with any of this. And it's quite remarkable, but politically, it doesn't seem to be damaging that much. It looks like Biden, I guess, will get most of the blame if inflation continues to be high, and the Fed may just get off scot-free yet again, except maybe amongst a certain percent of the population. I mean, it is clear that the Fed's reputation has suffered significantly, certainly since the days of Ron Paul in 2008 and again in 2012, because that actually made people really notice for the first time that the Fed was an institution out there that had enormous control over your life. And so this has only, I think, fed into this notion that this organization is run by people who have no idea what they're doing, and also that they're immensely powerful. But that's going to need time to percolate up to the actual policymakers in Washington. And I think maybe the Fed just remains a convenient fall guy. You could just say, hey, I'm the president. I'm doing my best here. And the Fed, these expert economists, they don't know what they're doing. That just seems to be a kind of a typical Washingtonian tactic, is let's have the seeming power divided up in enough places where we can kind of spread the blame around, and then maybe the elected officials can get out of it relatively unscathed. But I don't know how the current situation's going to end up. It could be that, yep, there will be a significant recession, and then just a few years from now, people maybe will have forgotten about it, but that's going to have to be a pretty serious situation. But anytime you start getting into predicting that sort of thing, people want an exact time frame, and there's just so many moving parts. I don't know what's going to happen or when.
Right, and to be fair, some of there'd be critics of ours, for example, right, that would say, "Oh well, it's easy to crow about high inflation rates in 2022 when you guys were predicting inflation after 2008, 2009, and that never came." And so, yada, yada, yada. But of course, there's a lot of, I think, important points to be made, about the damage done from low interest rates that weren't necessarily reflected in traditional inflation measures. And Bob Murphy's book, Understanding Monetary Mechanics, some great resources there for that. Highly recommend it. But you're right. There is very much this. For one, it kind of goes back to one of the points that you made at the start of the show, where the intellectual curiosity of the Fed has become far more restrained. You have a lot more people that think alike. I think that itself kind of trickles down from the current state of the economics profession and the quality of coming out of the universities right now. It is interesting to see the occasional Fed, in this case, the president of the Minnesota Fed, Neil Kashkari. He's someone who's actually written out explaining why he thinks that he was wrong about inflation and why it's much higher than he projected. Because while even, again, if you look at these statements from 2020, after you have, let's say COVID is this black swan event that you can't predict, and therefore, expectations that were had in 2019 no longer apply. Okay, there weren't any red lights flashing from prominent Federal Reserve members in 2020 saying, "Hey guys, I know this is a crisis, but there might be some consequences for the extraordinary measures we're taking right now." Right? If you look at 2020, 2021, they're expecting these to be short-term measures. They're not expecting any of what we're seeing now. And so again, even regardless of their thoughts between 2010 and 2019, at the moment when these policies were being done, there was no expectation that inflation could get this bad. And I think a big part of that is they have isolated themselves from outside points of view that could make these sort of objections. This was something Judy Shelton, who she herself had comments that were in favor of a very easy monetary policy. I'm not trying to say that she would have been some sort of great Austrian hawk on the Fed, but what made her interesting is that she had a perspective that was definitely outside the orthodoxy of the current Fed standing, and she was kept out by not only Democrats but also old school protect the institution, Republicans, and so she was the last Trump Fed nominee and prevented from being confirmed to that position, where you might have had something of a different voice, in their view. And again, it's fascinating how the way these technocratic Orwellian words can be used at times. But in order to protect the independence of this institution, they felt it was important to keep out dissenting voices. And the problem is that gets you right into the same DC pundits that talk about Putin falling into an authoritarian trap because a very rigid authoritarian hierarchy doesn't lend itself to outside criticism. These are the same people promoting the pageantry and the trying to romanticize a Federal Reserve institution that is not open to seriously considering outside points of view. And so it's interesting when you get those rare moments where you have some Fed members that try to explain their thought processes even when they're very wrong. But again, you scroll up and down the list of the people currently in charge, and there's very few people that are interested in such intellectual endeavors.
Well, it's good that you brought up Kashkari, right? Because he's kind of the poster boy at the moment for the politicization of the Fed. And while the Fed still says it needs to remain politically independent, and yet the Fed has been becoming more and more political in recent years. Now, in the case of Kashkari, he was actually out there campaigning for changes in Minnesota law, changes to their constitution. Is all related to some issue having to do with public schools there, which is not really of nationwide interest particularly. But what you have here is a very powerful member of the federal elite in your state, because he's theoretically part of this decentralized Fed structure. So he's at the Minneapolis Fed. But the reality, of course, these are people, extensions of the Washington elite. Nevertheless, he's out there in Washington openly campaigning for political changes. And then we saw the Wall Street Journal today, it was reported that when Senator Toomey tried to follow up on this and get a little bit more information about what Kashkari's actual activities were and what connection they might have had to the Fed establishment, the Fed institution, he says he was stonewalled. So on top of that, of course, you have the Fed saying, oh, the climate change is now a priority for us. And they're just adding now, I guess public schooling is now part of their quadruple mandate. It's no longer the dual mandate. The reality, of course, is it was actually really a three-way mandate, a tri-mandate, because it wasn't just max employment and stable currency. They were also supposed to encourage some level of economic stability as well. And it wasn't, but it was all related to jobs, inflation, economic growth, and interest rates. This is what they were supposed to focus on. But now suddenly climate change, suddenly schools. I mean, who knows what else these people are interested in that they're then going to decide they're going to leverage their power on the Fed to make a big deal of. And then they turn around and say, oh, we need independence because we're the Fed and we're a non-political institution. I mean, it's really quite astounding, but I guess they figure they're powerful enough that they can do whatever they want. And maybe that is the reality, but it shows yet again just what a big problem people have on their hands with reining in Washington power.
Well, I think a bit of this was a reaction to sort of the Trump populist sort of movement, because the difference between someone like Kashikari and Bernard is that Kashikari was originally kind of a Bush appointee, and so he's I think a less of a partisan, banner waving Democrat than he is a very energetic sort of political activist intellectual, right? So it's, almost kind of more like a Andrew Yang sort of guy, where he relishes like coming up with ideas for like all sorts of political problems, and he definitely was someone who kind of relished the role of being the anti-Trump Fed nominee from like an intellectual point of view, whereas Bernard was very partisan, but less active on Twitter and sort of new media, right? So kind of more of an old school Clinton sort of thing, where like Kashikari would be like more of an Andrew Yang sort of thing. And so I do think I have more respect for his approach in general than I do of Bernard and some of these other Fed chairmen, where he does explain at least what's kind of going through his mind intellectually. He's very active on the Twitter front, which is this very kind of the public spare in terms of serious intellectual thought, at least as serious it can be with 240 characters. He's someone who has his own Medium blog, which has been republished for the Minnesota Fed, but he's willing to be a lot more public with his views, but he very much is a completely different sort of creature than that old school banker's banker, right? And so like again, like this is I think himself an example of an evolution of this sort of technocratic position that I think you see it in other areas. I think someone who could be similar in this regard might have been from like another perspective would have been Ajit Pai, who was the FCC, the Republican FCC head that stopped net neutrality. And was very very public in sort of certain sort of libertarian conservative sort of policy reforms, right? And so he didn't have any problem on being more active outside of his sort of firm technocratic role. So I think they represent a newer guard within this sort of intellectual environment, which is going to create its own sort of the more Kashikaris you have, the more that will reflect a change in the institution of the Fed itself in ways that will be very interesting. But yeah, again, I do think he represents a different archetype as well. Again, an example of the escalation where the idea that Fed policy can be independent from what is good for the financial system in the most narrowly defined way. Again, like the lender of last resort, right? The idea that the only role of the Fed is being the lender of last resort is crazy talk now in modern American politics. And this is obviously not an American issue only. This is something that is now pervaded the entire world. But again, the idea that a financial regulator class can't look at whatever other social, cultural, whatever political values they prioritize, the idea of separating that from monetary policy is now completely out the window.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and leave it with that. We'll be back, of course, again in the future to talk about the Fed more with future FOMC meetings. Maybe there'll be some rate increase. Maybe we'll be surprised. Maybe they'll raise the rates 0.5 point, 2 months in a row. We'll see. Of course, by then, who knows where the inflation rate will be. But we will be back again in the future with another episode of Radio Rothbard. So we'll see you next time.